Hi, everyone. Welcome to Invent Your Mind. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Gayani. I am an intellectual property and business law attorney. I practice in California. So this information is for educational purposes only. If you have a specific question, please go see an attorney near you. So with that, I wanted to put this information about some biotech agreements. I was in biotech field. I was a scientist for 9 years at National Institutes of Health before I came to law. So I also work with some biotechs and biotech agreements. I have actually been in-house at a public biopharma before I launched my own practice a few years ago. So one of the things that is very specific for biotechs is you will see there are certain names like material transfer agreements, consulting agreements that are specific for biotechs, and of course, sponsor research agreements. So a little bit about these agreements and what you need to know if you're starting a biotech or if you're working with a biotech. So first thing first, every biotech agreement that out there, whether it's consulting agreement, or some other agreement, there should be confidentiality clauses in there, or you should have signed a separate confidentiality agreement. Sometimes in the biotech field, they are called CDAs, confidentiality disclosure agreements, or and the other rest of the field usually call them NDA, non-disclosure agreements. So, but basically what it does is weighs what can be said between the parties, the consultant or the biotech or the two biotechs that are negotiating some kind of a venture. So it's important to have that in the biotech consulting agreements or the confidentiality agreement. It's important for the attorney to understand what the scientists are going to be discussing. And this is where having somebody who have a biotech background can be helpful, because if the attorney doesn't have a familiarity with the parameters of the science that's being discussed, or don't understand the intricacies of it, then you may not be, the agreement may not address exactly what is covered and not covered. And that's where the trickiness is. So I would say if you are working with the attorney, see if they have experience working with biotechs, and if they work with like a technical specialist who is a scientist that can help them, or what's their backgrounds. That would be important. Secondly, if you're doing whether it's a confidentiality or consulting, you need to know what is going to be discussed and what is going to be disclosed. If it's two business groups, business development people from two companies, they will say, okay, this is the initial discussion. This is the only part we are talking about. If it's a company that is working on let's say a certain peptide, they're only going to be discussing the overall, and they're not going into the specific sequences or specific methods of how this is produced within the company, any of that information. So that's why you need to know that you can work with the business people and draw out that specific areas that can be discussed. But then it's also very important, if you're like the owner of this biotech and you have business development person who's going to talk to this other group, it's really important the person who are having the discussion understand what can be disclosed, what cannot be disclosed. So if you're attorney working with a biotech, you want to double check what's been shared. You may even want to check out their slide deck or whatever being shared. So that's a tip for any attorneys who might be working with a biotech, because that's where sometimes a scientist member of a team may have put in there some certain things that should not be disclosed. So those are really important. And if you're owner of a business, biotech, you want to take that precaution and make sure that you only disclose what's absolutely necessary. Now, I did mention a couple of other agreements. I do want to keep this video not too long, so I will just go into preliminary introductions of those and maybe put out some other videos in future, go a little more detail onto those. So one of the other things I mentioned is the material transfer agreements, MTAs. Those are used basically when you're sending a material like a peptide. Let's say you want a university professor who has a lab to study this further, and you are sharing the peptide. But if you are the biotech that's sending that to the lab, you want to make sure in the agreement that you have the material transfer agreement that defines what can be done, who should handle it, what data they can obtain, what data they must share with you, what can be published, when can it be published, because you always want to have, especially if you're in the industry, if you're the biotech, you had to remember that your priority might be separate from somebody in academia, because in academia, there's a lot of pressure to publish, while in industry, it's all about secrecy because you want to protect the IP rights, intellectual property rights. So you want to have those definitions in the material transfer agreements. Also, what happens if if they use it in a way that they combine it with something else? Now there's something new they're testing. And who had the rights to that? Does the biotech get full rights, or does the lab keep some of the rights, or do they get full rights? So, or any other variations of ideas that can be derived from this project, who have the rights to those? So those are things to discuss. And this also somewhat goes into a sponsor research agreement. So in the sponsor research agreement, so in the material transfer agreements, as the name implies, is a material being transferred, while sponsor research agreement is actually a funds that are being transferred. So sometimes a biotech will pay a lab, give the funds to a lab researcher, academic professor who's doing the research, fund that research project, because there is a value that can be taken, the data that can be useful for the biotech. So in those kind of agreements, also in the sponsor research agreement, you want to define how the funds are used, who will get to use it, how many reports that you get from the academic institution, how the data is shared. Are you going to get the raw data, or are you get the summary data? Because if that wasn't defined in the agreement, later on, it might be difficult to get the raw data that you may want to analyze on your own. Also decide if there's any renewals, publications. Again, a lot of academic institutions have very specific guidelines as to publications. So you want to be able to negotiate some, basically a screening before they go into publication, make sure that you file the patent applications. But that also brings in another part. You need to think about who's going to file those patent applications, because is this the university that is responsible? Are they filing it and letting you know? Or are you filing it? Are you responsible for those? Who's paying for the cost of patent applications? And what about the future projects, or any kind of a project that given birth by this project, what happens? And also with that, you want to keep in mind, going back to the first part of this video, the confidentiality. If there are students in the lab or other members in the lab, what do they get to know about this project, how the disclosure should be? Are they, and if there's specific confidentiality provisions that you are adding to make sure that it stays within a certain scientist and a team versus somebody else who might not be on that same team, but is still in the same lab. So you want to take a look at those, what can be presented in like a departmental meeting. If there's like a graduate student who has this project, are they allowed to present to other grad students or at a conference. So what the presentations can be covered, what the procedure that need to happen for the screening before that happens. So those are the things you want to think about when you are, negotiating one of these agreements, and make sure that you have these thoughts and processes. And if you're business owner, knowing that there these kind of different agreements help you to understand the some of where you're going to need that help from somebody who had the expertise in this area. Thank you. And there's other videos on startup strategies and other topics on my channel. So I hope you take a look at those. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, bye.